George was a young man full of dreams and determination, having graduated with honors from the University of Abuja. He had hoped his stellar academic performance would land him a well-paying job, but life seemed to have other plans. Despite countless job applications and interviews, doors remained closed, leaving him frustrated and disheartened. Eventually, George realized he needed to find a way to survive, so he took a job with a rideshare company to make ends meet. At first, he thought this was a temporary fix, a way to keep going until he could find something better. But as the months passed, George found a strange sense of comfort in the routine of driving. The job allowed him to meet new people daily, each with a story, each teaching him something. Before he knew it, days turned into years, and George was still behind the wheel, working tirelessly to provide for himself. One day he picked up a passenger named Angela. She was kind, warm, and had a smile that made George forget his troubles, even if only for a moment. They struck up a conversation that flowed effortlessly, and by the end of the ride, George knew he had to see her again. Over time, their bond grew, and soon they were inseparable. Angela believed in George, even when he doubted himself, and her unwavering support became his anchor. Not long after, they married in a modest ceremony and built a humble life together. They were soon blessed with 2 children, a boy and a girl, who became the joy of George's life. Angela chose to be a full-time housewife, pouring her heart into raising their kids and creating a warm, loving home. But with only George's income to sustain them, their finances were stretched thin, and George felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. Driven by love for his family, George worked tirelessly, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and sometimes even sleep. Every penny mattered, and he gave everything to ensure his family never lacked basic needs. There were moments of exhaustion when he would glance at his reflection in the rearview mirror, wondering if he would ever escape this cycle. But thoughts of Angela and the kids motivated him, reminding him that he was doing it all for them. Years passed, and while they didn't live lavishly, George and Angela's home was filled with love and laughter. His children were growing up to be kind, compassionate, and grateful, values he and Angela instilled in them. The year had ended, and it was Christmas season. Even though George wanted badly to spend time with his wife and kids, he knew the festive season was a cash cow in his industry. After breakfast, as the children excitedly spoke about their Christmas wishes and Angela prepared their holiday meal, George felt the familiar tug of guilt. He had promised to take the day off, to be there for his family, but the mounting bills that had been sitting on the kitchen table, along with the rent, electricity, and school fees, weighed heavily on him. The money he earned that day would greatly help them offset some of those expenses, allowing them to start the new year with less financial pressure. His kids, sensing his inner conflict, pleaded with him. "Daddy, please stay with us," his son Daniel said, tears welling up in his eyes. "We need you here." "Daddy, don't go." His daughter Lily added, her voice quivering, "We want to spend Christmas with you." Angela, too, shared a quiet, understanding look with him. She didn't say anything, but her gaze spoke volumes. She had always supported his work ethic, knowing that George's drive to provide for them was out of love. But she knew how much he needed this time with the family. However, the weight of their financial situation was undeniable. With a heavy heart, George stood up from the table, kissed his wife and kids on the forehead, and pulled on his jacket. "I'll be back soon," he promised softly, though he couldn't guarantee how soon. "This is just for today. We'll make up for it when I get back." He could see the disappointment in their eyes, and it hurt him more than he had anticipated. But as he walked out the door, he reminded himself of the bigger picture. Their long-term well-being depended on his sacrifices now. As soon as he started his car and turned on the rideshare driver app, a request came in, and George's phone buzzed almost instantly. He sighed, looking at the address. It was going to be a long day. He drove through the busy streets, his mind drifting between the love he had for his family and the financial burden that often shadowed his every move. The city was alive with holiday cheer, decorations twinkling everywhere, but inside his car, it was just him, the road, and his thoughts. Each passenger he picked up had their own story, some light-hearted, others more serious. George tried to make small talk, but the cheer around him felt like a distant echo. As much as he wanted to be home, he knew this sacrifice would help them, and that thought was what kept him going. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Christmas lights blinked on in homes along the streets, and families gathered together for their holiday celebrations. The thought of his family waiting for him, despite the tears earlier, gave him strength. He wasn't sure how much longer he could continue working this way, but for now, he would do it. For them. After a hard day's work, George counted the cash he had earned and felt a surge of relief and joy. He had made far more than he'd expected. People had been generous with their tips, appreciating his polite manner and engaging conversations. With this unexpected windfall, George decided to surprise his family with a few gifts. He stopped by a nearby store, picking out a beautiful scarf for Angela, a small remote-controlled car for Daniel, and a doll for Lily. As he was about to leave, his phone buzzed with another ride request. At first, he thought of ignoring it. He was exhausted and ready to head home. But when he glanced at the details, he noticed that the destination was on his route back. Figuring it wouldn't hurt to accept one last ride, George decided to take it. One more, and then home, he thought. When he arrived at the pickup location, a well-dressed woman stepped forward, holding a neatly wrapped package. Instead of getting into the car, she handed him the package and said, "Please deliver this package to the address listed on your app." She slipped a generous tip into his hand, smiling warmly. Surprised but appreciative, George accepted the task. Curious about the unusual request, George asked, "Is there anything specific I should know about delivering this?" The woman's eyes sparkled, and she replied mysteriously, "Just be careful with it. It's precious cargo." George nodded, reassured her it would be safe, and started the journey to the address. As he drove, he wondered about the contents of the package. There was something peculiar about the situation, but he brushed it off, focusing instead on the thought of reuniting with his family. When he reached the address, George parked in front of a modest house tucked in a quiet neighborhood not far from where he lived. He was excited that he would quickly drop off the package and soon be on his way home to spend some time with his family before midnight. But as George called the number on the package to come get their delivery, something unexpected happened. The man remotely opened a giant iron gate, revealing a massive, ornate mansion that took George's breath away. He had never seen a home so grand, with towering columns, elegant windows, and beautifully manicured gardens surrounding it. The mansion looked out of place in the quiet neighborhood, standing as a testament to wealth and opulence. George felt a flicker of awe, wondering what kind of people lived there. As George drove through the long, winding driveway, the front door swung open. A large man dressed in a Santa costume came out to greet him. His belly shook as he walked, and his deep voice boomed in the night air. "Merry Christmas, driver," the man said with a grin. "I'm Santa, at your service." George smiled and handed over the package, noticing the man's jolly demeanor and friendly smile. "Merry Christmas," George replied. "Here's your delivery." The man, still smiling, shook George's hand. "Thank you for bringing this all the way here. You're a lifesaver." He then pressed a generous tip into George's hand, much more than he had expected for a simple delivery. But before George could turn to leave, the man waved him over. "Wait, don't go yet. It's Christmas after all. Why don't you come inside for a quick bite? And I've got some gifts for your wife and kids too." George hesitated for a moment, but the warmth in the man's voice, coupled with the festive atmosphere, made him feel comfortable. The house was stunning, and the man seemed so friendly. Just a quick bite, George thought. I haven't had time to celebrate with my family, but they'll understand. The man gestured for George to follow him inside, and George complied, curious but still not suspicious. As he entered the mansion, he was immediately struck by the luxurious interior. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, and elegant furniture that spoke of wealth and refinement. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The man led George into a large dining room where a beautiful Christmas feast was laid out. Roast meats, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and all sorts of desserts. The smell was intoxicating. "Come on, sit down," the man said, motioning to a seat at the table. "You've worked hard today. Let me treat you." George, feeling a little out of place but too polite to decline, sat down at the table. The man poured him a glass of wine and continued talking with such ease and charm that George felt at ease. They spoke about their families, about George's work, and the man told stories of his own family traditions. For a moment, it felt like George had been swept into a Christmas miracle. The warmth, the hospitality, and the kindness were unlike anything he had ever experienced. He felt grateful, almost blessed, to be treated so well by a complete stranger. But as he continued eating, a strange sensation crept over him. His head began to feel heavier, his vision blurred, and his limbs started to feel unnaturally weak. At first, he dismissed it as exhaustion from his long day of work, but soon the feeling intensified. It dawned on George something wasn't right. His stomach churned and he tried to stand up, but his legs refused to support him. He staggered, barely able to keep himself upright, before falling to the floor. Panic surged through him as he tried to gather his thoughts. His mind was clouded, but through the fog he managed to mutter weakly, "My wife, my kids, please." His voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough for the man in the Santa suit to notice. The man's smile faded, and he immediately beckoned for someone to help. Within moments, two men appeared from a side door, their faces cold and stern. They swiftly moved to George's side, lifting him up despite his feeble attempts to resist. They dragged him down a long hallway, past opulent rooms and luxurious decor, until they reached a set of heavy double doors. George's fading consciousness flickered with alarm as they opened the doors and revealed a cold, sterile surgical room. The floor was gleaming white, and medical equipment lined the walls. This wasn't a festive home, this was a place of business. The reality of his situation began to hit him as fear surged through his veins. The man who had welcomed George in, now no longer the jolly Santa he had appeared to be, stood by the doorway, watching with a cold smile. George's mind was clouded, but his instincts screamed at him to fight. What is this?" he managed to croak, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. The man's smile widened. "I've been looking for a match for months," he explained, stepping closer. "I've been sick for so long, and no one's been able to help me. But you, George, you're going to save me. I'm going to take your liver." George's heart hammered in his chest. His body felt like it was shutting down, and the man's words were the final confirmation of his nightmare. The man had lured him here with kindness, with gifts, with a warm meal, only to use him as a test subject for his sick, twisted plan. "Please," George whispered weakly, his body no longer obeying him. My family needs me." The man nodded solemnly as though he understood, but his expression was cold, detached. "I know, and this is the only way I can survive," he said. "You've been so kind, so generous, George. But this is the only way." The two men who had helped bring George into the room began preparing the medical equipment, setting up the surgical tools with practiced ease. George could barely keep his eyes open now, but the horror of what was happening gripped him with a final surge of adrenaline. He tried to speak, to shout, but his voice came out in desperate gasps. "Please, I don't want this," he begged, his voice barely audible. But the man was unmoved, already giving instructions to the men, who were now preparing to sedate him further. As they attached a needle to his arm, George's vision began to fade, his last thoughts being of his wife and kids. His family, the love of his life, and the life he had worked so hard to provide for. He wouldn't be there to protect them anymore. As the sedative took effect, George's body slipped into unconsciousness. The cold, clinical lights above flickered as the sterile instruments were brought to bear on his once healthy body. His liver, the only thing of value to the man who had lured him into this nightmare, was harvested with cruel precision. His lifeless body was then placed in his car, his limbs awkwardly positioned, and dumped by the side of a quiet road. No one would know, at least not immediately, what had been done to him. Back at home, Angela's heart sank as Christmas passed without George's return. She waited for him, calling his phone over and over, but it went unanswered. Each ring fueled her growing panic. She tried to remain hopeful, telling herself that George was just caught in traffic, or maybe his phone had died. But as the hours passed into morning, her fear began to consume her. She had no choice but to report George missing. The weight of her worry had become too much to bear. But just as she was about to leave the house to file the report, a chilling sight stopped her in her tracks. There, on the side of the road, she saw George's car, surrounded by a crowd of curious onlookers. Her heart stopped as she rushed forward, fear rising in her chest. The moment she reached the car, she froze in horror. Inside, George's lifeless body lay sprawled across the seat, his eyes wide open, his body grotesquely mutilated. The stench of blood filled the air. Angela's world crumbled as she screamed, her cries echoing through the street. The bystanders who had gathered realized who she was and quickly offered their condolences, though they couldn't fathom the agony she was in. The police were called, and soon the scene was swarming with officers. They promised to investigate the murder, but Angela knew better. They had failed to solve any case in years. Her heart sank as she watched them take George's body away. She had no faith in their ability to bring his killer to justice, but in that moment, her sorrow turned to dread. What now? Without George, how would she provide for herself and their children? How would she survive without the man who had worked so tirelessly for their future? In the days that followed, Angela did what she could to hold herself together for the sake of her children. With a heavy heart, she sold George's car, the very thing that had kept their family afloat for so long, and used the money to arrange for his body to be returned to their village. But the reality of what lay ahead consumed her thoughts. How would she ever explain to his family that George had gone out to work one fateful day and never returned? How could she convey the horror that had befallen him? The drive back to the village was long, and the weight of the journey seemed to stretch on endlessly. Angela and her children sat silently in the back of the ambulance, the body of their beloved George lying cold in the front. The children, though young, understood something was wrong. They held each other close, their tears staining their cheeks as they leaned against their mother for comfort. Angela too wept softly, her heart aching for the life they had lost. Once they arrived in the village, the sight of the small, familiar place felt different. It was supposed to be a place of solace, of family, but now it felt like the sight of a painful goodbye. As they stepped out of the ambulance, Angela and her children were dressed in black. Their sorrow mirrored in the eyes of the relatives who gathered to mourn with them. The village was quiet, the air heavy with grief. Angela held her children close, trying to remain strong despite the overwhelming sadness. The world around them seemed to blur as she fought to steady her breath, knowing that the life she had once known would never be the same again. A grave had already been dug, waiting solemnly in the soft red earth. As the ambulance came to a halt and George's body was carefully lowered, the weight of grief hung thick in the air. According to the customs of their village, there was no delay. The burial would happen immediately. Angela's heart felt like it was breaking with every handful of soil that fell over George's coffin. Tears streamed down her face, but beneath her sorrow, there was something deeper, a burning anger and an unshakable resolve. As the final prayers were being said, Angela stepped forward, her eyes red and swollen but fierce with purpose. In her hand, she held a machete, one of George's old tools from his days working on their small farm. Without hesitation, she lifted it high above her head, the sharp blade glinting beneath the sun. With a force driven by heartbreak, she flung the machete into the grave, the metal landing with a dull thud atop George's casket. Silence fell over the mourners. Her voice trembled but rang out clear and strong, echoing across the cemetery. George, do not rest until those who did this to you are revealed. May their nights be haunted and their days filled with torment until they confess their evil deeds. The villagers, moved by her pain, raised their hands to the sky and shouted in unison, Amen. The ground seemed to hum with the weight of their voices, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the very earth mourned alongside them. After spending some time with George's family, Angela knew it was time to return to the city. The village had offered her comfort, but the weight of reality pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had children to care for and a future to rebuild. But how? George had been their provider, the anchor that kept their family afloat. Without him, Angela felt adrift, drowning in uncertainty. Bills piled up. Food became scarce. The life they had shared now seemed distant, like a fading memory she couldn't hold on to. Nights were the hardest. As the children slept, Angela would sit alone, staring at George's empty chair, whispering prayers for strength. But while Angela fought her battles in the living world, George's spirit could not rest. From the realm beyond, George watched over his wife and children, his heart heavy with rage and sorrow. The injustice of his death burned deep within him. He could not let his killers escape. In the cold shadows of the mansion where he had been lured to his death, the man who stole George's organs began to feel the weight of something unseen. At first it was subtle, a whisper in the wind, flickering lights, objects slightly out of place. But soon, Frank began to make his presence known. The man would glance into a mirror only to see George staring back at him. Hollow eyes filled with quiet fury bore into his soul. "You can't escape me," George's voice echoed, even though his mouth never moved. The first time, the man dismissed it as exhaustion. But the visions did not stop. Every reflective surface became a gateway, and George's face was always waiting on the other side. He watched him. At night, the torment grew worse. George entered his dreams, standing silently at the foot of his bed, his shadow stretching across the room. The man woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding uncontrollably. Sleeping pills offered no relief. No matter how much he took, George was always there. The man's health began to deteriorate rapidly, his once confident demeanor replaced by paranoia and fear. One evening, desperate for peace, the man smashed every mirror in his house. But George's reflection didn't need glass. He appeared in the man's nightmares, in the still water of his sink, in the dark glass of his phone. George's spirit whispered relentlessly, "Confess, confess, confess." The man's grip on reality began to slip. Terrified and broken, he knew that no matter how far he ran, George would follow. For a week, George's presence grew stronger, more intense. His anger was unrelenting. From the great beyond, he reached out and began to torment the man who had stolen his life. Whenever the man stepped outside, he would feel the sting of an invisible whip strike across his body. The searing pain would cause him to stagger, falling to his knees in agony, but there was no one around to see the cause. People would stare, confused and frightened, as the man ran through the streets, screaming in pain, looking like a man tormented by invisible forces. His clothes were torn and his face a mask of desperation, but no one could understand the madness that had gripped him. He was desperate, pleading with anyone who would listen, but George's spirit would not relent. Each time the man tried to escape, the phantom whips would strike again, each blow more painful than the last. The man, now broken and unstable, had no choice but to do the unthinkable. In a moment of overwhelming fear, he turned to the only place he thought could offer him some relief. He took to a live stream. Shaking and barely able to control his trembling hands, the man went live on social media. His audience, initially puzzled, quickly realized that something was terribly wrong as he broke down in front of the camera. With tears streaming down his face, he confessed to his crimes. His voice cracked as he admitted to killing George for the sole purpose of harvesting his organs. He spoke of the deal he had made and the pain that followed, revealing the extent of his greed and cruelty. "Please, I didn't want to do it," he sobbed, "but now I can't escape him. I can't sleep. I can't think. He's tormenting me. Please forgive me." And in an act that would forever change Angela's life, the man, barely able to breathe from the weight of his guilt, transferred $10 million into an account in Angela's name. Meanwhile, Angela had reached her lowest point. Starving, struggling to make ends meet, she was preparing to sell her smartphone just to afford a meal for herself and her children. She had no choice. Without George's income, everything was slipping through her fingers. Just as she was about to part with the phone, the screen lit up with an incoming call. It was her friend, but Angela wasn't in the mood for small talk. "Angela," her friend said urgently, "you need to watch the news right now. George's killer, he's confessed. It's all over the live stream." Angela's heart skipped a beat. Confessed? Could this really be true? Her hands trembling, she quickly opened the live stream and watched in stunned silence as the man who had stolen her husband's life confessed to the gruesome crime. Angela's eyes filled with tears as she heard the man admit his wrongdoings. And then, almost as if by miracle, she saw the transfer notification of $10 million sent directly to her account. It was more money than she could ever have imagined. But even with the wealth, the sorrow in her heart couldn't be erased. George was gone. Yet this confession, this gift, somehow felt like a small, bitter piece of justice. Angela sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the turn of events. The anger, the heartbreak, and the confusion swirled inside her. But one thing was clear. George's spirit had not let his killer escape. He had made sure the truth came out, and somehow Angela knew that even in death, her husband was watching over them. The man's confession spread like wildfire, drawing the attention of authorities and the public. The case, once thought to be another unsolved tragedy, now became a national headline. With overwhelming evidence from his own live stream and the testimonies of those who had witnessed his bizarre public outbursts, the man was swiftly arrested and put on trial. Angela, still grieving but now financially stable, attended every court session. She sat quietly, holding on to George's memory, her heart heavy but resolute. The courtroom was packed, and the weight of justice hung thick in the air as the trial proceeded. The man's defense crumbled under the weight of his own confession. No plea for leniency could erase the cruelty of his actions. The judge, unmoved by his tearful apologies, delivered the final verdict, death by hanging. As the gavel struck, Angela felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and closure. Nothing could bring George back, but knowing his killer would face justice gave her some peace. When the trial ended, Angela stepped outside, the sunlight warming her face. Her children stood by her side, their hands wrapped tightly around hers. "Daddy got justice," her son whispered, looking up at her. Angela nodded, fighting back tears as she kissed his forehead. "Yes, he did," she replied softly. Though George was gone, his love, strength, and the justice he fought for from beyond would forever live on in their hearts.